Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, dear participants, honorable panelists, a very good afternoon for this second and for today last working session towards a sustainable landscape approach, a new generation of integrated watershed management programs for rural development, resilience, and empowerment. That is the title of this session in the afternoon. The host, convener of this session is the Global Donor Platform for Rural Development. And key members there is the World Bank, the FAO, the GIZ, the German Development Corporation. CIFOR has been contributing largely. And this session this afternoon has a number of specificities. We will have 3 presentations. The presentations will very much focus on real life, real project experiences. No theory, but real practicalities. Number 1. I will announce and introduce the speakers as well as the subject later. After each section, we will have a discussion of about 10 minutes where you are free to ask your questions, to make your comments. Then important also, this session can be seen worldwide on a live stream. So we'll be connected to quite a number of people around. I do hope that later we get also some numbers, how many people participated, and we will get some questions from all around the world. Over there behind is Peter Casier sitting, and he is capturing and collecting the tweets, the feedback from those who are following the live stream around the world. Okay? Yeah, with this introduction, not to forget, at the end of the third presentation, we're going to have a 30 minutes time discussion, so quite sufficiently to in-depth debates, comments, and hopefully also some hints and looking forward recommendations, what to do next, who is going to take up what. I would like now to invite Pascal Corbe from the Global Donor Platform to say a few words of welcome. Pascal, please.
Good evening, everyone. I'm a bit overwhelmed. It's a huge crowd. I mean, not here, but probably outside. I've been asked to just say a couple words about this institution, the Global Donor Platform for Rural Development. I'm working in communications in the Secretariat. And just 2-3 words. It's about, right now, 37 organizations, member institutions. All the big bilateral, multilateral donors are in there. And from the member side here is FAO, GIZ, and World Bank involved in this particular event. The institution has the purpose to look after what everybody's talking about, the coordination, all these Paris Declaration things. And for that, it sets up, for example, common ground perspectives and looks into, as the word says, common ground initiatives and so forth. And this event is just one of many, many things that it organizes online, events and all sorts of other initiatives that you can see. I just want to leave it with that. I was just asked very spontaneously. So I hope you enjoy it, and it's going to be a bit more fun. Thank you.
Thank you, Pascal, for this very brief and precise orientation. I would like to invite now Crispino Lobo. He is an alumnus of the Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics, India, and the Kennedy School of Government of the Harvard University in USA. He has, on top of this, a number of academic other degrees, but I think what is much more important, he was for more than 10 years, if I caught it correctly, for 13 years, managing director of the Watershed Organization Trust, WOTR, in India, and he will talk to us very concretely of this experience on watershed management in India. Presently, Crispino is the managing director of a microfinance and entrepreneurship development center called Sampada Trust, equally based in India, in Pune. Now, Crispino, the floor is yours. Please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Peter. And thank you, all of you, for coming here to hear us. It's much appreciated. WOTR stands for the Watershed Organization Trust. It's an NGO, basically. What I'm going to be sharing with you today is the experiences of this NGO in various large-scale programs, but focused on climate change adaptation. Currently, we are in 6 states of the country, and in terms of watershed development, supporting projects in about 1.8 million acres, and on our own, in about 800,000 acres of our own. We are a capacity building agency, besides also implementing projects directly, and to date, in terms of training, capacity building, we've supported over 320,000 people from 27 countries and 26 states of my own country. We're also a group of 3 organizations, actually 4, on top over there, doing different things and all spun off from water. These are the various sectors or thematics that we are engaged in. The reason I'm putting this down is to emphasize the point that if you really want to build adaptive capacities, you need to approach the issue in a multi-sectoral and multi-dimensional context and framework. Because when you look at people, their livelihoods and their lives, and communities for that matter, it's all these various drivers that actually impact their quality of life, as well as the degree to which you can build their resilience and help them to adapt to climate change. So we should not look at simply one sector and focus on that. We need to look at the multiplicity of sectors that actually impact people's lives and with which they are interacting and dealing with simultaneously. This is the context of our work. We work only in rain-fed areas, dryland areas, which, as you know, are already impacted by climate change, market forces, and a depleted natural resource base, leaving behind fractured and vulnerable communities. So this is our constituency, and this is our target group. These are the problems that we try to address: lack of firewood, lack of drinking water, malnourished children. In fact, you know, India has got about 46% of our children malnourished, and lack of fodder and water for cattle. So these are the challenges, some of the challenges that we face. To address this, we have developed what we call as the water engine for adaptive sustainable development. And we focus on the 5 capitals. And we believe that if you develop them simultaneously or to the extent possible, then you move inwards towards security, material adequacy, and ultimately this is the goal, which is wholeness. That's what all of us are finally striving for. But you need to have a framework in which to situate and assess or measure your activities and their impact. Watershed development. We believe ecosystems management is the hanger on which you can hang many of the other developmental interventions that you do. So that for us is the basis of our interventions. The idea being that, as I told you, in dryland areas, water is the limiting factor. So if you can trap rainwater, for us, the only real water we have is rain. It falls in 4 months in the year, but actually speaking, we don't have more than 10 to 15 days of rainy days when you have what is called harvestable rainwater. So if you don't catch that rainwater in those 15 days, then you're in trouble for the rest of the year. And the idea of watershed development is water that is running, you slow it down. Water that you've slowed down, you make it walk. And walking water, you stop. And water that you have stopped, you force it underground. So how do you do that? Right from the ridgeline, these are the valleys, these are the ridgelines and the valleys, right from the top, you do a series of mechanical, vegetative, and biological treatments that basically impede the flow of water, arrest erosion, and slow running water. Catch rain, basically, wherever it falls. That's the idea of watershed development. And you do a number of treatment. These are continuous contour trenches on which you do plantation, both of trees and grasses. As you come to the farmlands, you do compartment bundings. Along the drainage line, you do what is called stone bunds and gully plugs. If you notice, the whole idea is to create barriers to rushing water, because that's what actually the whole ecosystem is based on, the hydrological flows. Now, along the drainage line, we focus on, of course, gabion structures, earthen nulla bunds, masonry weirs, percolation tanks, then water harvesting structures, and changes in land use. Agriculture is a key driver in this whole aspect of land use management. At the essence of it, the heart of it is people, but we'll come to that. We also have to look at biodiversity, because that's what actually produces and provides for the bulk of consumption as well as economic needs of people in these countries. Water, that's the essence to adaptation and resilience building. And so for now, it's not enough that you harvest. What I had shown you earlier was harvesting rainwater. But today, we need to look at productivity of water. It's not enough to get maximum output per piece of land, but as much crop or output per drop of water. So for us, getting communities to handle water budgeting, to assess how much of rain fell, how much water they have, you need to train them in water budgeting. Then, as you know, agriculture is the largest consumer of water. So you need to match crop water requirements with available water, practice environmentally safe agriculture, as well as focus on soil health, deploy water conservation technologies. These are very key. That is integrated water, pest, and nutrient management. In other words, basically, adaptation today calls for a fairly high level of scientific knowledge and application. It's not rocket science, but it has to be demystified, but there's no escaping the key driver or input of knowledge in making agriculture sustainable and viable. And of course, you demonstrated seeing is believing, so farmer field schools play a key thing. These are some of the examples of what we do. Basically, these are water efficiency enhancing technologies. We've developed automated content management systems to provide agro-advisories to farmers, demonstrations on the field, competition among farmers to spread replication effort and foster peer-to-peer learning. This is an important component in our interventions today, agrometeorology, because in monsoonic climates and all over the world, local weather conditions are no longer as they were 10 years ago. They've changed. And that, of course, affects farmers because now they're faced with a situation that they were never confronted with in the past. And so they have to learn new ways of handling new problems for the same old crops and methods that they were using in the past. So we have developed a whole meteorological package or system wherein weather information is put on the village boards, shared with the farmers, and they are trained to understand what it's all about. But here is the heart of it all. In India, we have the Indian Meteorological Department, which is actually the service that provides weather advisories to farmers. So what we have done is we have linked up with them, in which we have got about 51 agromet stations, which are telemetry linked. 29 of them are telemetry linked to this institution. It's a government institution, scientific institution. And they get this on an hourly basis, weather advice, weather information from the villages themselves. And they give us, in return, on a daily basis, weather forecast on a 3-day basis, 3-day cycle. On that, depending on the crops grown in those areas and the soil types and the farmer conditions, we have developed an automated content management system that matches these weather advisories to crop requirements, and we bundle them together as a crop agro-advisory, as we call crop weather advisory. And you can notice we use GIS, remote sensing, as well as people's traditional knowledge. We then shoot it out to the farmers in 3 ways. One is through mobile SMS technology. Where that is not prevalent or effective, then we have wallpapers and public address systems which give information to farmers. Once they are tried, tested, feedback is generated, and then we reconfigure the knowledge module. So this we found very interesting and very helpful because it gives farmers a lot more assurance into how to handle the changing weather patterns that they are experiencing. In addition to that, from the perspective of upscaling and replication, because we don't do anything unless it can be upscaled, we've developed a number of tools, the latest of which has been already released. It's on the web. And that is this core drive, which actually helps communities to identify their vulnerability and actually plan measures that will enhance their adaptive capacity and reduce risk. A number of other tools which will also be released, freely available on the web, which will be supported by software programs so that you don't have to redo everything and analyze the data again. It will be, you just have to upload it on the web and you'll get reports generated based on the system and the location you are in. It's primarily adapted for India at present, but eventually we will be expanding it. What are the impacts? Take a look at this village. The rainfall pattern here is about 300 to 400 millimeters. That's semi-arid, almost near desert conditions. This is how it looked in 1996, 1999, 2009. And it's changed the community's life and economic profile completely. This same village, if you do an assessment of it, this is how in 1996, when we began the project, the total output in the village was, say, about 10 million rupees. By the time they finished this project, it was almost 6 million rupees, so it increased phenomenally. 60 million rupees, it's 6 times more. Now the key thing was this community would migrate for 6 months in the year because there was no water in the village. There was nothing on which you could survive. The good news is after all these years, the people have not only come back, they've actually, well, poverty has gone down so dramatically, it's difficult now to identify the same people who once we saw as poor today. The point I'm trying to make is when you do environmental regeneration along watershed lines well, in an integrated, multi-sectoral approach involving the community living in those watersheds, the impacts are transformative. This is actually a watershed of 1,500 hectares, about 15 square kilometers. If you look at the red, this is false color composite. Look how it looks just 3 years later when you do watershed development. So the forestry, the biomass has increased phenomenally. We did a study and look at the amount of impacts just in after about 2 to 3 years of work. It's substantial and it's long lasting because, you know, once you get water right, the rest follows. These are some of the pictures which actually show how the water situation has changed dramatically, and once that happens, there's a massive diversification of livelihoods as well as income-generating activities. And formerly it was only agriculture, now it is floriculture, application of new technologies, non-farm activities, livestock, the whole works. For us, this is key. Because if in developing countries, particularly India at least, if parents send the girl child to school, then you can be almost sure that their economic as well as social situation is improved considerably. Because otherwise, the first casualty is the girl child. They'll yank her out of school or they won't send her. In this village, when we started the work in 1996, there were only 20 people going to school. There was hardly any girls with them. Today, everybody in the village goes. It's gone up to 400 people, and the majority of them are girls. So for us, the key, whatever be the indicators we may have, the key indicator in my context and country is if the girl child goes to school and is kept there, you're fairly certain that it has made, the work has had a substantial impact on the poverty condition of people. Some of the policy impacts, as I mentioned, that we do not take up anything unless it has the potential to be upscaled and taken up by government or national actors. So these are some of the things that we managed to do. Set up a huge fund in India, which is now taking this across the country. We developed methods called the net planning, which has been adopted in government programs. In India, to treat forest land is important because it occupies the top of the watershed. So we got permission to treat that, and many of the approaches and techniques that we developed are now mainstreamed in national programs. How is it done? At the heart of it is people. So we deal with village institutions. We do not replace them. We may add to them, but we don't replace them. And we get them to work and do what they're meant to do. So we negotiate with village representative institutions, particularly local self-government bodies. And you need to bring a lot of technology and science and rigor to the development initiative. And so we'll use a lot of systems dynamics, systems approach, a lot of techniques and technology, and we focus on various aspects. But the point is this. At our end, it may be high-tech, it may be modern science and technology, but at the village level, the challenge is to demystify this and make it so simple that they remark, yeah, but we always knew that. Once that is their reaction, you've hit home. And that is precisely the measure of whether you're getting to them or not. You need to address several issues in order to be successful, otherwise it won't. And that is including gender. This is the key. In the beginning, we did not pay attention to this 20 years ago. But we realized that unless you mainstreamed women and their concerns in decision-making processes, as well as local institutions, you would not only not be able to do it well, you would not have sustainability either. So gender has to be handled right from day one and quite sensitively and cleverly too. It doesn't pay to keep the men out of business. It's important to get the women into business with the men, and that's the key challenge. Sustainability has to be thought of from day one. So unless communities are not only trained, but handle the money to implement projects, it's not likely that you're going to have a surviving institution or effort after the project closed down. Because nothing works when a community exercises control over money and is accountable to it, to the community. That's when they develop responsibilities, systems, and mechanisms of continuing what they have done. In fact, they invest into that. The trouble often is we provide technology, we provide support, and somebody else handles the money. We believe that you've got to give it to the community and accompany them as they spend it according to sanctioned projects. Because that learning by doing is what actually builds up capacities to continue with the effort after the project formally is closed down. When you go to scale, you need to also deploy a lot of methods, technologies to be able to monitor, control, report, and basically generally steer the project. And so we use a lot of technology, but that's at our end. So satellite imaging, GIS, and we can tell you actually, this is a cadastral map. Cadastral map is actually the land holding pattern in a village. Using GSM phones, we can tell you on each piece of land what we are going to do, how much it's going to cost, the time frame, and how much the farmer is going to contribute. In other words, you can track on every parcel or piece of land what is the present status, what is going to be done, how it's going to be costed, and you can follow this right through a project period. And you need to use technology for that. This is another village. This is the cadastral map, so the boundaries of the plots. We got data that can tell you who is the owner, what is exactly the land holding, the land capability, slope, erodibility, soil types of his piece of land, and what is the socioeconomic status. So we can actually work out interventions at the beginning, track the impact over time, and follow it even after post-project period. This is another use of technology, both ground truthing, remote sensing, as well as GIS platforms, which now take this piece of land, say number 59, survey number 59. See the type of crops that are growing on that. You need to track this down if you're going to give actually crop and locale-specific weather advisories. For instance, if a farmer is growing, say, for instance, wheat, he wouldn't want to get from you advisories that are particular to potatoes. You need to give him advice for wheat. But here's the trick. He's growing it on land which probably has got 3 types of qualifications. Could be a light soil, could be deep soil, could be medium soil. There are different advices to be given for these conditions. So you need to know actually not only what he's growing, but where also, and also the type of land on which he's growing. Then you can give locale-specific advisories. Now to do this, you need to have technology. That's why I showed you earlier, we developed a content management system, which is an automated IT-supported program, which actually picks up matches weather with crop requirements and then gives the advice to those farmers in which it's linked into a GIS-based platform. Take this, for instance. This is a village, and this is how it looked in December 1992. Now, if you look at this, it's December 1992, it's December 2000, and December 2011. The rainfall for all these 3 seasons is comparable. It was around 500 millimeters. Now, this red is a false color composite, which actually tells you the vegetation, the biomass. It's greenery, actually. This was before we started work. Look at that in 2000, and look at it now. So in the same rainfall, you can see the impact of watershed development, and this has been the huge changes that have taken place. Now, obviously, we can see the economic status of communities have improved phenomenally. To that extent, their vulnerability index has gone down, and their capacity to and the ability to take risks and to mitigate risk has gone up also correspondingly. So the point is you need to have a holistic approach to building capacities, both adaptive as well as mitigative. You need many partners. You can't do this alone. So obviously we have several partners, and what I've shared with you is also the experiences in different parts and amounts of 3 major programs. One is the Climate Change Adaptation Program, which is supported by the Swiss Development Corporation and NABARD, which is a government bank. The Indo-German Watershed Development Program, which was funded by the KFW and the GTZ, in those days, now GIZ. These are some of the private parties involved with us, as well as governments. So you need to bring a multiplicity of stakeholders who complement the effort and who share the same interests together. And that's also part of the challenge of managing such projects, if you want to go to scale. You need also knowledge partners, particularly if they are national knowledge institutions, like we are dealing with ICRAF, for instance, the Indian Meteorological Department, state agriculture universities, central institutions, as well as private institutions. So you need to bring a whole group of people and institutions together. What are my concluding remarks? You see, climate change in rural areas impacts ecosystems, water, livelihoods, and economic activities. Now, all of these are rooted in and interact across watersheds. So in rural India or rural contexts, people are all living in watersheds. And that's where actually the impacts of a variable climate play out. So you need to look, the geographical unit for interventions in building adaptive capacities must, in my opinion and submission, be the watershed. Now, you can define them from a few hectares to millions of hectares, but practically, it's good to define it between 500 hectares to 1,500 hectares. That's manageable, or at least in what we call the space of survival of the community. Where people are living and what they consider their area of survival, that would be a good enough watershed to start with. Secondly, if you need to build capacities, you need to see the interrelationships between all these various components, that's livestock, water, agriculture, livelihoods, how they interact with the landscapes, with the community dynamics, and with a wider market framework around which they're living, in which they're living, and to see exactly where exactly is the vulnerabilities, what are the risks, and how do we actually mitigate them. Those various tools I had showed you earlier, they're actually meant to address several levels of these gaps or vulnerabilities. And the third and last is, therefore, if you really do what we call landscape management along watershed lines. Now, why watershed lines? Because often, for us, for people, watershed development is basically a landscape affair. It's just land and soil, water conservation. But actually, it is the hydrology of a place that keeps a community there or actually disperses them. If there's no water, a community packs up and migrates. So when you talk of watershed development, you need to keep not only the conservation perspective of the ecosystem, but also the hydrological perspective. So you need to talk of not only landscape management, you need to talk of improved water use efficiency. Because we learned through the hard way is that it's not enough that you make water available. More important after that is how people use it. You could have a situation where actually they could become even worse off after watershed development than when you started off, if they simply do water mining, which is a danger when people come into water without knowing how to manage it efficiently. So improving the efficiency of water is key to building adaptive capacities. It's not enough that you produce more and cleverly and better. It's also important that you get more value for that you produce. In other words, from the farm gate to the plate, the entire value chain is something that we need to look at. And lastly, of course, market access. For the farmer is key, because unless he realizes better value for his produce in terms of better incomes, it's not likely that he would be willing to accept the discipline as well as pay the price of doing things better and more sustainably. Thank you. As you said, they're catching the rain everywhere. That's the theme and the motto of an adaptive program. Catch the rain wherever it falls. Thank you.
We let enough time for the applause for this beautiful presentation. Crispino, thank you very much for this, I find, very systematic presentation, starting from the water, ending with the water, talking about your basis of intervention, your evidence-based intervention based on data, your services, the scaling up, and then this marvelous impact from the various aspects, economic, ecological, and social as well, addressing. Good. Now, Peter Gazier, what is the online community asking and commenting so far? Let's start the discussion. We have now 10 minutes to talk about. And if you give us one or two insights here.
It looks like the community in India is still awake at this time of the day. I'll condense it into one question for Mr. Lobo. In what way are these projects redeployable in other areas of the world, which are also rain-fed? Are there any issues to consider when you would like to redeploy the same technology, the same procedures as you have done?
You want an answer now?
I would suggest let's maybe collect one or two comments in addition here from the crowd here. Thank you, Peter, first for this feedback. And Magdalena will provide you the microphone. Yes, please.
Hi, Oliver Springate, Baginski, University of East Anglia. Thanks, I very much enjoyed the presentation. I'm a bit familiar with watershed work in India. One of the big concerns seems to be how to regulate groundwater extraction. We know that the Ganges Basin is one of the most rapidly exhausting groundwater reserves. So has there been any legislative process yet to introduce some sort of common property or local property regime to regulate extraction within sustainable levels? Thank you.
Thank you for this question. Yes, please, sir, over here.
Yeah, Stefan Weise, Biodiversity International. My question is about the crop adaptation to the changing environment and to the fluctuations from year to year that you're mapping. To what extent, besides different crops, does the program consider in terms of the diversity within crops, or the genetic diversity and local diversity versus varieties that may be distributed by seed companies, etc., so that diversity within intra-specific diversity would be of interest to know?
Thank you. Yeah, Crispino, I think no more questions right now. We take the chance. Please, yeah, you can go up there, or you can do it from the seated place, as you like. Yeah.
So the first question, if I got it right, I think this is not working. Is it? Okay. The first question was how applicable or replicable this is in other contexts in different countries, if I got that correct. I think it's perfectly replicable wherever. You'll have to modify it and to suit local conditions, both economic and social conditions, as well as the particular geographic conditions in which you're working. But in principle, in terms of the method and approach, it's applicable everywhere. Maybe the sequencing will change, the emphasis on various sets of activities will change, but largely, wherever rain falls and wherever people are living, it can work.
Crispino, what I got from that very first question is, would you change, if you would be now again thinking 15 years back and you would start again, would you do something different than what you did in the past? Is there any learning from the application of that one?
Yes, I would, of course, one of the key learnings we did was we assumed that once water came, people would use it wisely. I wouldn't assume that so easily anymore. I would start with the assumption that once water comes, it's going to be exploited badly. So how do we already start thinking of systems that can maximize, optimize rather than maximize, optimize the productive potential of the water, the incremental water you get, without yielding, leading a community into water mining. Because, in these areas, the largest catchment of water is groundwater. In fact, Indian agriculture is as much as 60 to 70% dependent on groundwater. Now, watershed development basically raises the groundwater levels, recharges aquifers, raises the groundwater tables. Now, the challenge is, people who have not had enough water over a lifetime and for generations, when they get suddenly this availability of water, we all know what happens. When we come into something new for the first time, we splurge. One of the things we would do is already starting at the very beginning, introduce concepts, practices like water budgeting, for instance, and then matching it to crop water requirements in a way that optimizes yields per drop of water, at the same time does not yield to result in environmentally unsustainable agricultural practices. Because with water comes in the need to use fertilizers, pesticides, and then your whole issue of soil health starts getting affected, including the environment. So we would relook at it differently from these end outcomes that we want now. Okay. The next point that the question was, how do you, about groundwater management? Yeah, in India, of course, groundwater is a private good. Unless there is a calamity like drought, for instance, when the government can actually impound water sources and then make it available to the community. Otherwise, unlike minerals, where below 3 feet it belongs to the government, water is actually a private good. However, of late now, government is thinking seriously of ways of how to regulate it. They're going to be doing a national groundwater survey soon, but the point is this. One of the reasons why it becomes difficult to create sustainable water markets is in a context or a regime of uncertainty, how does a farmer or the owner of that water, how does he know how much he really has and therefore how much he can share, or at what point should he stop extracting because the extraction rate is higher than the recharge rate? So unless we are able to develop robust, reliable models for assessing groundwater flows, it will be quite difficult, in my opinion, to regulate groundwater in a way that can be enforced consistently, number one. Number two, to be able to even develop robust water markets, you need to have a fairly consistent and reliable amount of electricity. Now imagine a situation where power can be off the grid. I mean, there's no electricity for 12 hours. Then what is the incentive to the farmer to regulate his water flow? What he does is he keeps the pump. All of them are sub-water pumps, I mean underwater grounds. He keeps it on. Now that's most foolish in terms both of extraction as well as energy use. So you need to have also reliable and known consistent supply of electricity. And thirdly, he also needs to know when he has, supposing he has both these, he knows how much water is there, he knows that when he will get what type of electricity, how much crop water is really required. So he, at the bottom of it, unless we can get the uncertainty out of decision-making opportunities with regard to groundwater, only then, in my opinion, you can really develop effective legislation which can be enforced. So you need to go, if you want to avoid tokenism, then you need to develop good science. The last question was crop, yes, about crop biodiversity.
Crop adaptation, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, as you know, the Green Revolution has also been, in one way, very good. On the other hand, it also led to the replacement of local varieties with very standardized crops like wheat and rice. It had its purpose, it had its value, but today there's an awareness growing that we need to go back to crop biodiversity, agro-biodiversity. And we emphasize and focus a lot on indigenous land races. We promote them in a big way. And we found that if you use very simple methods, the productivity of these indigenous races can increase substantially. Now, it may well be that you need to apply technology to improve their productivity, creating maybe better improved seeds, maybe even high-yielding varieties. We're not against that. But we are saying preserve what you have, optimize its potential, and then develop it further using science. This is important because if you look at the perspective from food sovereignty, you need to have people masters of their own seeds, because that's the only way in which you can assure access to it without having to be taken to court, So for us, it's important that you develop seed banks in the villages using local varieties and optimizing the production. We would very much focus on that. That's why we have gone into biodiversity as a specific intervention in an adaptive strategy. Because we realize that in our area, when India is one of the biodiversity hotspots, we have a very rich flora and fauna, and many species of agriculture value actually have in them genes that are quite often well suited to addressing rising temperatures, fluctuations in rainfall, and even scarcity. Salt tolerance, for instance. Now, these are available in the wild. We need to identify them. We need to ensure that the rights to those races reside in the communities. And then, if you need to exploit them commercially, should in a way that the benefits come back to the communities that provided that. And one of the good things in India is we have the Bioconservation Act, what they call the People's Biodiversity Register. We are working with the People's Biodiversity Register in a big way, so that what belongs to a community is recorded in those according to the Act and over which they have community ownership.
Okay, thank you, Crispino, for this first round of clarifications. I would suggest to stop here now and to go to the next one. Nevertheless, to retain Crispino possibly for the final discussion, I think this rather fundamental changes like water as a private good to a public good. I mean, that's a fundamental change, and supposedly there are some other fundamental changes requested by other presenters too. Let's see what comes up. And of course also the lessons to be learned from the application, first question which came up there here. Okay, thank you very much again, Crispino. Now, the next presentation is dealing with the following subject: watershed and landscape management for multiple benefits and climate resilience. And this based on lessons learned from East Africa. I have the pleasure to present to you Ms. Sally Bunning from FAO. She is presently Senior Lands and Soils Officer at the Land and Water Division in Rome. By training, education, she is a geographer and worked in various different research assignments in schools, universities, etc. After all, having more than 30 years experience in development and development work with a focus on watershed and sustainable agro-ecosystem management, mainly in Africa. Please, Sally, the floor is yours.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy you're all here, even though it's getting late, and I hope you find my presentation interesting. I sound very old when it says 30 years of experience, so I hope that I can do justice to those number of years. I'm going to talk about participatory integrated watershed management, some principles, some experiences of two projects. One, the Kagera River Basin Transboundary Agroecosystem Management Project, which works in Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi, and a CEDA-funded project strengthening capacity of farmers to adapt to climate change through land and water management. I will talk about some issues, strategies, and actions, and then I'll bring together some lessons learned on making a case for investing in and promoting participatory integrated watershed management for food security and climate resilience. FAO did a thorough review of watershed management some years ago and came out with this publication, which you see here, in about 2006 with 12 key principles. And I think we can add on those principles today, learning from the experiences since then. This review was done in each region and then a global consensus on what the principles were. And I will run through some of these principles, like treating the underlying causes and drivers, not just the symptoms, the importance of having an evidence base for planning and management, integrated approaches, which we've heard about in other sessions, holistic planning, co-funding and partnership, as well as low-cost interventions, institutional arrangements, etc. And I will cover these, actually, and there's no need for me to read them all. I'm not going to read this definition, but definitions vary according to the agency. And I wrote this definition myself on the basis of what I've learned over the years, adapted from World Bank and other interveners. But what's key here is that it's people-centered, it's a participatory process, it's wide-scale, and we have to pay attention to the investment. Without investment, we can't really have a watershed approach. And the aim is to address the soil, the water, the biomass, the biodiversity through a systems approach so that we're looking at productivity and income, climate change, socio-cultural well-being, and issues of heritage, etc. We need to do a holistic planning because what you do in one part of the watershed will influence what happens in another part of the watershed. And so it's really important not to just have a number of technologies, but to think about the interactions between these technologies in the watershed or catchment. And there's a number of processes that one goes through, from the characterization, developing the watershed plan, putting in an enabling environment with the governance, the institutions, the policy support, implementing the plan, monitoring and assessment, and then continuing the process of renewing and updating the process. This is the Kagera River Basin. It's a typical situation in Eastern and Southern Africa: degradation, soil, burning, lots of charcoal production, deforestation, livestock pressures, and we can't just look at the degradation. We need to look back at what's the causes and what's the drivers of these changes. And we have a very ambitious project. The aim is to put in place sustainable land management in 21 districts across this huge basin. And in order to do that, we need to look at what's happening in terms of population pressure, in terms of fragmentation of land, overexploitation, what's happening in terms of tenure insecurity, which is the driver of poor management practices, differential access, low knowledge base. There's a market demand for commodities, but not necessary for integrated systems approaches, and in general, weak policy support. So how to address all these issues? And the first step is the community awareness of how they can benefit from restoring their ecosystem, how they can benefit from getting more productivity, but a better lifestyle from their own environment. And this is a key step in developing a watershed plan. It involves lots of dialogue, discussion with all the actors, and then identifying practices that are already being used in the basin and that can be replicated, improved, and developed. And the key issue here is that soil and water conservation is very labor intensive, so one really has to show the benefits in terms of productivity so that farmers will adopt spontaneously rather than having to be pushed in order to do the changes. Diversification is the way to increase the income. So one needs to look at the multiplicity of opportunities in the landscape: crop, livestock, forests, trees, fruits, vegetables, etc. And one can put together a whole range of practices in the watershed, in the appropriate positions, to really get a better productivity, and then farmers will invest in that by themselves without having to be led by a project. We need to build on local knowledge and innovation. This is an example where we're documenting best practices across the basin. And this is one of the best practices where water is being harvested from small roads, collected on farm, and managed through mulching and reducing evaporation. This is another one where the farmers are building diversion ditches and then progressive terraces and putting this across at a landscape scale. So it's a really important process to document this, but also to show what are the costs and what are the benefits so that one can obtain investment funding to scale up. It's very important today to show the importance in terms of reduced resilience to climate change, because that's where the government investment is. That's where money is available to address climate change. So we have to show that land and water management is actually contributing to climate change adaptation, but also to mitigation as well as increased productivity. If one can implement these practices across a landscape, obviously one has a range of benefits. So we need to document not just on farm, but what are the impacts at a landscape level. And here we have some examples of wetlands that are well managed for rice production, but also the slopes that are well managed through bench terracing for wheat production or for other crops. What we're trying to do here is, this is not just a crop-specific process. There's a lot of tree planting going on along the contours, across the slope as well, but that's not yet very visible because it's still about the third year of the project. And what's very important is monitoring the impacts in terms of productivity, biodiversity conservation, above and below carbon, soil restoration, marketing and income, and community empowerment. We're also using the Farmer Field School approach for capacity development, and this is a participatory learning and action research process where the farmers learn by doing, by monitoring, by reviewing what their progress is, and then we use various tools to assess knowledge change, what they would like to learn the next season, and it's an iterative process. what's important is to document the benefits, and we use the WCAT tools. WCAT is the World Overview of Conservation Approaches and Technologies, which has developed with FAO and partners some questionnaires for assessing different practices. These are assessed on the ground and put into a database, and then the database can produce very nice extension materials and books that can be used then for scaling up with partners. So we're trying to use this in the projects we're working in. It's important to show the off-site benefits and the off-site maybe disadvantages of different practices, because maybe if you're collecting all the water upstream, then the water's not getting downstream. So we have to understand that an intervention may have a cost, but it may also have a disadvantage, and then to weigh up and to analyze with the different stakeholders. We need to also find out that there are low-cost interventions that farmers can take up on their own behalf without having to need investment. And here's an example, just using local materials to make cross-slope barriers. Sorry, I couldn't find a very good photograph for this intervention, but it's really important, the cost issue. And then the other issue is public-private partnership to bring in private sector to invest in watershed management through, for example, payments for environmental services. And here on the right, we have some beautiful lakes that are really important for ecotourism in Uganda. And on the left-hand side, the hydroelectric power station, you can see the color of the water. Obviously, their costs of treatment of water are very high. And so if you can show that by improving the watershed management, you can have an effect on the water quality, you may get a partnership going. The CEDA funded project in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania has a four-pronged approach: restoring soil health, water management, livelihood diversification, and building resilient communities. And one of the areas in Ethiopia is the Woruba watershed in the Awash Basin. You can see it was very degraded when the project started. And the watershed is about 600 hectares, a typical watershed intervention. And a lot of effort was put on practices to retain surface runoff, rainwater harvesting, rotational and zero grazing practices, biological conservation, and also the soil management. And also efforts were put into local governance and livelihood diversification. This is really important. Community bylaws for better regulating practices in the watershed. Energy-saving stoves to reduce the deforestation for charcoal, for example, and diversification of income sources. If farmers can see the benefits, then let's say putting in beehives in a forest, then they'll be much more likely to protect that forest rather than cutting it down. This is a very important slide because I'm not talking very much about tenure, but it's critical to watershed management. Here we have in Tanzania an example of an irrigation scheme downstream, and the upstream settlers had no investment, and they're very poor smallholders. They were being blamed for using all the water upstream, for causing damage downstream when there was flooding. The local government was trying to fine the upstream users for bad practices or push them off the land. They were using the legal recourse. And in fact, through getting the two groups to talk together, upstream and downstream, coming up with a consensus and collaboration, there was a possibility for the two actors to really help each other to invest in the upstream and to then find solutions. And so if there is conflict resolution is a really important part. But it also, so I didn't really mention the tenure, but the tenure issue is a major issue because if people are not secure on their land, they're not going to invest. And that was the situation. These smallholders were not secure. They had moved in the 1980s. They didn't have secure rights. and that was part of the reason for the poor practices. So part of the watershed plan is getting security of tenure for those farmers. Some of the results in this particular watershed was that 380 households reduced water scarcity. There was improved soil and water management, so reduced flash flooding. There were ponds which allowed farmers to diversify, etc. And it's really important to monitor these benefits. Lessons from these two projects.
You have 2 minutes, actually. Only.
I've got 2 minutes. I've got 5 lessons. One is strengthening the capacity of small farmers to adapt. So making sure that you're really meeting their needs and problems, but also addressing issues of gender. Here you see women walking with water. You see also women working in the field. By a community approach, one can get a better balance of labor by really just raising awareness of the community members and seeing how the men can also participate in activities. Capacity development, it's ensuring continuous support from the service providers, the policy makers, through a collaboration with the farmers. So it's dialogue with the different actors. And ensuring a long-term approach so that all the actors in a watershed have a common strategy, but that strategy is a revolving strategy. It's updated on a regular basis, and it involves all the stakeholders and sectors to intervene and to be working together. And also the importance of getting data for further investment. So we work at various scales, from the farm to the river basin scale, and from the farmers, the communities, the technical sectors, the river basin authorities, so various levels. And we work with the different institutions, community and catchment planning, district land use planning and budgeting, and support for sustainable land management, and the policy making, making sure the policymakers are involved and integrate and mainstream watershed management into their national strategies. And finally, raising awareness of policymakers and making a convincing case that land and water management is crucial for climate resilience, and that we have a degradation scenario which is pretty sad: natural capital being lost, poverty, food insecurity, risk, migration to cities. There's an alternative win-win scenario, restoring ecological services. And if one puts one's efforts together, one can really come out with addressing the key challenges of most governments, which are poverty and food security. But it does mean we've got to make some changes. We've got to bring together the biodiversity strategies and action plans, the national action plans for desertification, and the climate change action plans as part of the mainstream agricultural strategies. And if they remain separate, we're not going to achieve anything in the long term. This is crucial that we find ways to bring these together, and the landscape or the watershed approach can maybe help us to do this. Thank you for your attention, and sorry I gave you a huge number of slides in a very short time. I hope you'll have an opportunity to look at these again, and to provide any feedback would be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally, for the presentation. And just to take up the huge number of slides you just were mentioning, of course, all of you can again revisit all presentations in the internet. They will be uploaded and will be made available for everybody. So you can look at it again, take it, download it, and use it again. Second remark, yeah, okay. Second remark, Sally, allow me a very personal one. It's 25 years now I left Rwanda. I was working there for 4 years in a Projet Agropastoral de Nier-Bisindu. You might have heard of that one. And where we precisely, in those days, we didn't call it watershed management. It was ecological agriculture, actually named, but precisely what you showed now, and it's really beautiful, impressive for me to see it's workable. If, and that you made also clear, you really have to think in long terms. It's not quickly done. That is probably for me one of the key lessons to learn here. Okay, thanks again. I see. Peter, you are ready already. You have some reactions from the crowd online. Please share it with us.
Always ready. There was a remark with Sally's 30 years of experience. We all know that Sally has started at the age of 5. Hi, Sally. Haven't seen you since the longest time. How are you? All right. Seriously, a bit of more explanation about the link between land tenure, security, and water, and general natural resource management. Which one is driving which? You explained one way. Does it also go the other way? Repeat the question. The link between land tenure, security, and water and natural resource management, which is driving which? I think you explained an example of one way. Does it also drive the other way?
Yeah. Thank you, Peter, for this chicken and hen or hen and chicken question. What is driving what then finally? All right. But you here in the hall might have some other comments and remarks. Questions, please. Yeah. Very much in the background. Magdalena will bring you the microphone.
I just want, Oliver Springate, UEA again. I just wanted to ask, how do we work at the basin level transnationally, particularly in terms of damming of river basins? Any suggestions, or is it not possible? Thanks.
Yeah, watersheds do not know national boundaries sometimes, no? Good. Okay. Here, the center.
Hello, everybody. My name is Lotta Semson. I work for Stockholm International Water Institute in Sweden. Thank you for very nice presentations and very interesting regarding water management. My question is, it seems like you've been running very fruitful and successful projects. Would you say that the approach, do you still have a driver in the way of a project, of organizations coming there and starting the projects? Or is the approach kind of self-evolving amongst local societies?
Yeah, okay. Who invents, who brings it in? Is it an intervention from outside or a real self-help approach? Okay. Sally, I think take the 3 issues. Land tenure, land management, the question of the transnationality of watersheds, and then where does the approach finally comes from? How does it get into a system?
Thank you. The land tenure issue, I think that fundamentally, land tenure is crucial for getting investment in land and water management. And in Rwanda, they've actually given every farmer a title now. It's been a program that's been running for about 5 years. And it'll be very interesting to see what change that will bring. There are a number of other countries that are following suit. There are very few examples where land tenure has really been approved across a whole country like it has done in Rwanda recently, so I think it would give a good case. The FAO has developed the voluntary guidelines for responsible tenure of land, fisheries and forestry to try and address this tenure issue from a policy perspective. But what's really important is that, from my experience, it's really important to go hand in hand with the local level, securing tenure through a management plan. And I think it's not necessary to come up with the ownership. one can actually secure tenure rights through having rights of use for a longer period of time. Already, that will give farmers the opportunity to think about their longer-term vision rather than thinking from season to season or from year to year. So the land and water management, if it's managed well, then obviously there's a risk to land tenure because people might be pushed off the land when they manage the land well because somebody else wants that land. And that's a real issue in Africa where a lot of people don't have titles to their land. So yes, it can be a double-edged sword. I don't know if that really answers the question. It's giving a few perspectives there. Transboundary. The Kagera River Basin is a transboundary river leading into Lake Victoria. It carries 24% of the water leading into Lake Victoria. You saw the color of the water. There's no way in a 4-year project we can think about having any impact on the color of that water, on the sediments, on the problems. But if we can show through a watershed approach that that's what the government needs to be doing, investing at a larger scale with the other actors and partners, and through collaborating with the other countries, because the water runs from Burundi and Rwanda through Uganda and Tanzania into Lake Victoria. There's a need for collaboration and cooperation. So at the moment, there's discussions on putting in a hydroelectric power station at one of the points between Rwanda and Tanzania. And we're trying to show the government on the need to invest in payments for environmental services to really help the communities to then protect that hydroelectric power station. So one does need to work at all levels, from the local community to the national governments, but also the transboundary issues. And we did the same in the Nile Basin. Is another example where FAO provided support to all the Nile Basin countries to improve all the countries' capacity to negotiate in terms of water allocations from the Nile Basin. And this is still a major issue. Egypt uses a huge amount of the water of the Nile Basin, and the other countries have a much weaker negotiating power. And so you need one, so the projects over many years with Italian-funded support were to help the negotiating, the data information of the other countries to negotiate. So negotiation, conflict, collaboration, really at all levels. The issue of the drivers and the time lag in terms of how an approach evolves, I would say in the Kagera Basin, it's a GEF-funded project and it's far too ambitious. But if we can show enough impact on the ground, the idea is to work with districts so that they will actually be putting in a budget line in their district budgeting and planning for watershed management and sustainable land management. That way it can become a sustainable long-term program, but without having that sort of a planning intervention. I'm afraid that a lot of our activities are project-bound, so we learn fantastic things on a 4 or 5 year project, and then you move away, and then because the donors don't want to put in money for longer periods, and this is a huge challenge. And so we need to find ways to partner, and the GEF is very good by saying if you have a GEF project, you've got to partner for co-funding, and I think it's a fantastic strategy, because unless you have that co-funding and partnership, you're never going to go beyond to really have an approach that's being developed and being mainstreamed like it is in India. I think your example in India was fabulous, Crispino, and it shows of a real mainstreamed effort. I'm afraid in Africa, there are fewer and further between such examples. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. Subsequent to these explanations and answers, one more question, possibly. Not? Okay, then we are respecting perfectly the time. And I would like to invite Dieter Nill to give us the third and last presentation of this afternoon. Dieter Nill is an agronomist and did his PhD in soil science. He's worked for quite some time, we leave the years now away, mainly in Africa as a consultant, and but has as well experiences from Asia too to bring in. And since almost 2 years now, 1.5 years, he's working for GIZ on a special project, subject matter project, where the issue is on water management and agriculture, agro-biodiversity. His presentation he's going to bring us here is integrated landscape management in Niger under changing frameworks. So we're going to the drier area now compared to the 2 presentations we had so far from India and from East Africa. And it's a presentation which is referring to a project which was mainly supported by the German Development Corporation, both by technical and financial cooperation. Please, Dieter.
So thank you very much, Peter. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, as Peter said, I want to present you some experiences from Niger, and I think that's a proof that the same approach can be repeated in several countries without problem. Needs some adjustment, but otherwise it's quite feasible. But before presenting the case study from Niger, I would like to reflect a little bit on the landscape approach in general and how we sort of integrated that GIZ in the territorial concept that we used there. So if you look at the territory, we define it as a spatially cohesive area here. So now in this area, you have a lot of economic activities, for example, economic processes, there are enterprises and so on. There's a certain social setting going on, different population groups and so on. There are institutional settings, there are government services, there are NGOs, there are other organizations in this unit. And there are, of course, natural resources in this unit. So this unit, of course, doesn't stay uninfluenced. There are external influences acting, impacting on this unit, on this territory. There can be, of course, national policies. There can be climate change, of course, and the global economy, like price fluctuations, can impact on this unit here. Now, the boundaries of these units, they depend on the development potential. So we look at the development potentials of such units, and we may come up with different boundaries, not only taking natural resources as the boundaries. So this gives us a small model. So we define the different territories. We may choose, for example, an economic delimitation. So if you think about development corridors, as you have them in Southern Africa, for example, the Maputo corridor and so on, where you link a producing area with some processing centers, and then perhaps with a harbor on the coast to export the produce. So this is another territory, what we call a territory. Of course, very often you have administrative boundaries, like you may choose villages, or you may choose municipalities or provinces that you like to develop. So administrative delimitation. You may have also ethical or cultural delimitations, so sort of spaces that are defined by culture, like if you think about indigenous territories in Latin America, or if you think about tribal areas as you have them in India or in Pakistan. And then you have, of course, ecological, geographical delimitations. If you take the hydrology, then you come up with a watershed. If you take wildlife, it may be a transfrontier conservation area, for example. So the boundaries may change. So if we talk about the landscape approaches, for us, we sort of group it rather into these eco-geographical delimitations. So in the case of a watershed, we take the hydrological system. So this is just a concept to clarify a little bit. Of course, in practice, in real practice, sometimes these different groups of delimitations are overlapping. And this is also the case for this example that I would like to present you from Niger, where we try to start work with villages and later on with municipalities, but which all are in watersheds, of course, so it's a bit overlapping. So if you have a look at this program in Niger that has been running for the last 20 years approximately, so it's situated here. It's working in the areas of between Niamey going up to Tawa and Agadez here. So a rather big area where it is working. I don't have to mention the context very much. Most of you will know the situation in Sahel countries. So there is a rather high population growth, which is important, as we will see. We have very severe land degradation. Well, high temperature, you know, is still increasing with climate change now. We have declining, less reliable rainfall and severe droughts since the 1970s. And I guess you all know the reports about the impacts of these droughts. Now, the program has been funded by BMZ, that's the German Ministry for Development Cooperation. It has been implemented by the government of Niger together with GIZ and KfW, the development bank. Now, between the early 90s and 2010, some more than 400,000 hectares have been treated with different types of soil and water conservation measures. And this with a rhythm of about 20 to 30,000 hectares per year. And on top of that, more than 200 water spreading weirs, and I will explain what it is, have been constructed that sort of have created an irrigated area of about 10,000 hectares. So you don't have to remember all these figures. I only show them to you in order to explain, with this approach, large-scale impacts are possible. So we are not at a project level. We don't talk about a dozen of villages. We talk about hundreds of villages that we work with. We don't talk about some 1,000 hectares. We talk about 100,000 and 10,000s of hectares. So it is the approach really offers a large-scale impact. Now, if you look a little bit at the techniques, that's quite classical. If you look at this transect here, we have the transect, we have the plateaus up here that are used for livestock, that are used for forestry mainly. Then we have the slopes here, rather degraded. And we have the very important hill foots where all the fields are, the rain-fed fields are. And then we have the valley, how is it going? We have the valley bottoms with the fertile but also very degraded soils down there. So now for each of these landscape units, there are specific types of techniques that are used. And here on the plateaus, it was mainly nardy trenches that were used here. Then on the slopes, different types of techniques were used. In the fields, it was mainly stone bunds and planting pits. And down here in the valleys, it was water spreading weirs, which is a newer technique that I will shortly explain afterwards. So different techniques specific to each landscape unit. Now, if you look at the costs, and this is quite important, the costs are very reasonable. So in order to treat here the soils on the plateaus, this was at a cost of 130 euros per hectare, which is not that much. If you look at the fields, farmers' fields, you treat them at a cost of 30 to 45 euros per hectare. Well, in here, it's more cost intensive. If you look at the water spreading weirs, 600 to 1,500 euros per hectare, but still quite reasonable. And on top, if you think about these costs are not taken over by the project, but there's a very strong contribution of the population. So if you take these things here, the nardy trenches, about 55% of these costs are taken over by the population. If you go to the stone bunds, around 40% of the costs. If you could talk about the planting pits, it's even 90% of the costs. It's the population that does most of the work, really. So this is quite important in order to judge these approaches. Now, you also don't look at all these figures, but what I would like you to remember is that we have here a very cost-efficient approach, a very integrated, effective approach, and we have a very strong contribution by the beneficiaries, by the population. So that's important about it. Now, perhaps very quickly, everybody knows what stone bunds are. Perhaps you don't know these techniques. These are nardy trenches, so there you have a special plow behind the tractor. This plow sort of rips the soil open, which creates micro basins. In these micro basins, a couple of 100 liters of water can be stored, and these micro basins are planted to grasses or to trees and shrubs. So that's how it presents. These water spreading weirs, that's a newer technology, so it's not dams, so there are not no water reservoirs that are created, but there is a flood coming down the valley, so these water spreading weirs, they sort of spread the water all over the valley floor, so the water is spread over the soils, get the humidity, the water infiltrates into the soil, and then it goes further down. So that's how it looks in reality. So you have a vast area that is well irrigated, but that is flooded in a way, and you can use the area below and on upwards of the water spreading weirs. Now, what is the work approach of this program? So the program only intervenes if the villages actively ask for it, so there must be some agreement within the village. Then the program takes a rolling approach. It sort of works with 100 villages at a time in parallel. So the first year is used to give a lot of training to organize the population, so there are village development committees set up and so on. A lot of training in the first pilot activities start. Then we have years 2 to 5 where the very intensive implementation is carried out. And then we have years 5 to 6 where the program progressively disengages and the responsibility is shifted over to the villages. Population provides free labor, local materials, and the maintenance. Program provides the training, gives tools, material, trucks, and tractors. That's the setup. But what is important to remember here is that the people need time. So 100 villages, about 6 years of intervention. This is because labor in the villages, the labor resources in the villages, they are also limited. So villages or farmers only can sort of treat a couple of hectares per year. So their resources are limited, and the program also needs time because after the first 100 villages, there are another 100 villages. So you have an approach where new villages are coming in all the time, and other villages become independent and autonomous. Now, let's have a look at some of the important results, and I think this confirms what has already been presented. If we look at the work on the plateaus, so there we have this herbaceous biomass, which is basically fodder for the animals. So after the treatment, you have some 600 to 700 kilograms of biomass, herbaceous biomass that is produced, fodder basically. If you look at the wood, it's not that much. 1 steer per hectare, that's about 1 cubic meter, so not very much, but it's also a very harsh and tough environment. But once the vegetation has established, then biodiversity gets improved, so wildlife comes back to a certain degree, and other plant species also re-establish. And of course, once you have the vegetation there, the lower areas are protected. Now, if you look at the fields, which is sort of the bulk of the activities, here you have increased yield, so Crispino already said doubling the yield is no problem. So you can double the yields, that's also our experience. So you have at least 200 kilograms grain more per hectare, and 200 kilograms of grain that corresponds approximately to the need of 1 person for 1 year. So treating 1 hectare with these measures gives you food for 1 person for 1 year at a price of 30 to 50 euros per hectare. So this is quite reasonable, I think. But the other effect that the farmers like very much is that they stabilize their yields. This means if there is a dry year, they still will yield something, while other farmers that have not treated their land won't have anything at all. So the stabilization for them is very important. Well, of course, with the grain yield, also straw production increases. So this is important for the animals. It's important for the construction, for the roofs and so on. Important also for the mulching of the fields. So if we look at the valleys, here we have the most significant effects, also the biggest investment. So yields are doubled, but the production is increased times 6. Why is this the case? So yields are higher, but as I said, the water is spread out over a large area. So increase in yields plus extension of the area gives you a real increase in production here. So this is during the rainy season now. During the dry season, they can start with irrigated vegetable production. So this is labor intensive, creates employment and income. And there is a very significant increase of the groundwater levels. So access to water, not only for agricultural uses, but also for the women especially, gets much, much easier. So very significant effects here. So to summarize, significant positive effects on food security, but also on food stability. There's income on ecology and on the living conditions in general. Now, 20 years of program implementation, that's quite a long time. And as Sally said, a lot of the projects, they only run for 3, 4, 5 years. So what were the external influences about that I talked already? And they were quite prominent, while these internal processes, the approach that worked quite nicely, without problem. There were not many problems here, but there were some external influences that sometimes put the whole program at risk. Sometimes there were also opportunities. So there were some technical innovations, and I presented already these water spreading weirs. They were quite important, and they started development by the end of the 90s. It took about 10 years to adapt the technology really to the local conditions. Now it works very nicely, and it complements the entire approach. It complements the technological package to treat these valleys. So this was quite nice. Another innovation was also the value chain approach. So in the beginning, the program focused really on the production side. But when then, with this vegetable production especially, it became more and more interesting to link the farmers up to the markets also to get some income. So this was positive, very good opportunity. Then we had some conceptual challenges, and these were quite, I would say, quite risky. This was around the time 2000 to 2004, when German Development Corporation, this means Technical Corporation, GIZ, underwent a very severe restructuring, so the projects were concentrated into programs. This took quite some time, and it also took quite some energy. It was one of the causes why Technical Corporation drew out of the program, so this nearly sort of stopped the program. Fortunately, Financial Corporation continued with the activities, so this sort of saved the program. This was quite a risk for the program. Later on, Technical Corporation came back on board. Then at the national level, there was the decentralization policy that became more important in Niger. And, well, it was decided that bilateral German development cooperation should focus on the decentralization sector. So there was a decentralization program that was started, and you can perhaps imagine the gymnastics that were necessary in order to integrate now this very rather large soil and water conservation program into a decentralization program. This was not easy, and it was also quite lucky that it that it was possible finally. And the funny thing, it worked out quite well. It worked out quite well because, Sally mentioned it, these municipalities, they finally integrated these natural resource management activities into their municipal development plans. So it went quite well in the end. There were several institutional changes. Well, Niger, in the last 20 years, there were several new governments. There were, I don't know, at least 2 military coups or 3 even. So each time there were changes in the ministries, of course, so the institutional setup changed the program. Sometimes it was sort of linked up with the Ministry of Planning, then it was linked up with the Ministry of Agriculture, finally it was linked up with the Office of the President. So there were some hiccups. This all takes energy, but luckily all the activities on the ground, they always kept on going. Well, climate change came up. This was around 2007 when the subject came up in the program. This was, but not a problem, this was rather an opportunity, because I think the activities that are carried out, this is climate change adaptation, also mitigation par excellence. These measures that are carried out, they stabilize the production, they increase the production, they give income and so on. So no problem at this one. And then a very major problem right from the beginning of the program until today, this is the growing population really. The population of Niger grows at a rate of 3.3%, which means that we can produce a lot more food now through these measures. They are quite successfully. But basically this food is used to nourish an increasing population. It's not really sufficient to increase the quality of life of the individual. So that's a main challenge, I guess. So I would say as a conclusion here, especially external challenges created risks, but also sometimes opportunities. It was not the internal processes. Now, some of the conclusions, I think landscape approaches offer multiple benefits. They are very powerful and low-cost concept to improve food security and incomes. They have very positive environmental effects, like on biodiversity, on water availability. And they are very suitable to mainstream climate change adaptation and mitigation. They have the potential to have large scale, to be scaled up, really. And they also improve the governments in rural areas by involving all these stakeholders and by integrating the know-how across the different sectors. People from different sectors have to work together. And they really mobilize and strengthen the capacities of the local population here. Now, what are requirements, what are success factors of such programs? And it was already mentioned before. I think the participatory bottom-up approach was essential, and the involvement of all these stakeholders. We use a multi-level approach, which means that we have some activities at the national level in order to get the policy and legal framework right. This gives us the liberty to strongly implement at the middle, the meso level and the micro level, where most of the activities take place. I think such programs, in order to become successful, they have to be implemented medium and long term, which requires a very strong political will. And as I showed you, the several risks that come up when let's say, new hypes of development cooperation come up, new subjects come up, and everybody runs after these new hypes. And this sometimes brings these programs under risks. Well, food availability per capita can only be improved if population growth is not too high. So ideally, such programs should be accompanied by some other programs that talk about demography. So we have documented some of the results in the brochures, and also from Chris Bino, some of the materials are laid out there in the corner there of the room. So please help yourself, and otherwise, thank you very much.
Okay, Dieter, thank you very much for this nice presentation, and thank you also for ending with one of the guiding questions now for the final round of discussion. We have still around good 20 minutes to do so. What are critical success factors in achieving, and this question, of course, would be valid equally also for the other two cases, the other two presentations we had. But first of all, Peter has again some reaction or a question from the crowd online. Please, Peter.
It's a philosophical question. Can I ask philosophical questions? The question is, somewhere, if these are not really the typical, and despite the good results, typical water management projects. So in how far are we just relabeling existing technology, 20 years old, and put a landscape approach on it? Is this really a landscape approach? Because it looks like just water management project.
Yeah, thank you very much. We have in German a nice proverb. Alter Wein in neuen Schläuchen. I don't know how to translate that one into English. It's old wine in new barrels. It's not precisely translated. So do we just, I mean, that's a key question, do we just have a new label for what we did before? And my remark, Sally, before, when I said 25 years back, we started similar things with these approaches and thinking, etc. That's certainly one of the questions we would like to go into. Yeah. Here, now you are free to not only ask questions, but also give your evaluation, your assessment of what you heard so far in these presentations. And this in terms, what I said before, what are success factors, critical ones? What potentials do we see for scaling up, for really bringing into a solution for large scale? And what are preconditions which must be met finally in order to advance, to proceed? Yeah, there was, okay. Now the hands are going up, very nice, please.
Okay, I'm Marius Keller from the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Thanks very much for these three very good presentations. My question goes into the direction of the repackaging. And since we sort of are here in the context of the climate change conference, it's about climate change. So it was briefly, I think, mentioned in the last presentation. climate change as a sort of context factor, and I'm sure that many of the solutions you presented are climate change measures. But the question would be whether you actually have, in some of your projects, looked at what climate change specifically means for your context, and whether it actually means that some of the activities would have to be changed. So can you just do whatever you proposed and it will just work the same way under climate change? Or does it mean that we have to do certain things differently? Thank you.
Thank you. The new aspect of climate change, and certainly 25 years back we didn't think of that one, and I would like to ask the question also to Crispino. When he started with watershed management, was the climate issue already on the table? Probably rather not, and what to do? Please, Madame.
Mariana Rufino from CIFOR, Center for International Forestry Research. We are working for the climate change program. Many of the things that you have done in the past, in the last 10, 15 years, are the things that are needed to work with climate change. But the question is, when you want to do development programs, who is funding now 10, 20 years implementation program, where projects are at best 3, 4 years, and we have to live with it and deal with climate change?
Not only $100,000, but $100 million question probably, no? Which funder, which donor do we find to engage for 20 years or 30? You can increase that.
Thank you. My name is Jan Peters from Michael Suche Foundation. I normally work with peatland rewetting restoration, so I also deal with the challenge of keeping the water back somehow. But that's not the question. I also want to refer to the other question which we had before, that you were talking a lot about that watershed development is a very good tool and measure for climate change adaptation for the rural communities, especially in these very dry areas, and that you're also using very modern techniques for weather observation and forecast and so on. But my question is, in times of climate change, we already see the climate changing, especially in these dry areas. We see the changing rainfall patterns or droughts or flash floods and stuff like this. Do you also take kind of regional projections for climate change into account? Or, for example, I know that many development agencies, also GIZ, have these climate proofing tools in which long-term, and this I also understood that all these programs have to look for a longer time frame. Do you use such tools to kind of prove if the investment, if the measure of these projects will also last for 10, 15, 20 years more to the future?
Yeah, okay, let's take this one, the last one, and then we try to...
Okay, I'm Bastian Rauman from CATI in Costa Rica. We've seen a lot of basically biophysical improvements, changes in practices. In any of the three cases, do you also have changes in the socioeconomic structure of the landscapes or territories, maybe better in that case?
Yeah, maybe that question can be enlarged in a way that all the presentations have been at least focused, very much concentrated on natural resources and water, watershed management, etc. So what about economic aspects, social aspects, cultural aspects, etc.? That would be certainly one of the questions. Yeah, may I invite the speakers to take... if we go around the question of this repackaging, no? I mean, what makes the new generation, as the title of this session also is suggesting, finally, maybe we start with that one. Can we, yeah? and then Sally, you might also amend and comment on that one.
Okay, with regard to the repackaging or the old wine in new skins, I think it's basically a question of emphasis. Watershed development, if understood classically, in which the community is at the center, which means the following: a ridge to valley approach, an approach that takes into consideration the land capability when determining activities to be undertaken. When you keep in mind the use pattern, the land use pattern of the community, and the way they depend upon environmental services, and when the focus is to stabilize and increase environmental services, then basically what you're talking about is actually landscape management. So watershed development, if done in a comprehensive manner and in a holistic manner, which is community-led, is actually, in my submission, landscape management. Now, therefore, you know, as time passes, words come to mean different things. And some words that were understood in a particular context to import a particular meaning, over time loses its power and new words come in. So to that extent, yes. I mean, if you may say, it's not so much repackaging as a recommunication of a concept that was always there. It's a question of emphasis also. Now, it's not just repackaging. You see, the same word itself acquires different meanings over time in response to emerging and evolving situations. Like, for instance, in climate change context, it's not enough to talk only of watershed development. It's also important to emphasize that particular aspect of watershed development which could best address the issue of vulnerabilities that arise due to climate change adaptation. So in time, even landscape, that word itself may lose its importance, and another component of watershed development would probably gain prominence, because that would be then addressing more specifically that particular need that is arising as a result of changing factors, either climatic or environmental or social or economic. That's with regard to, is it old wine in new skins? It isn't.
Thank you, Crispino. Sally, you would like to add here?
Yes. Well, I think watershed management is one of the well-known landscape approaches for hilly environments. And if you're working in a very flat Sahelian environment, maybe it's difficult to convince the villagers to think about a watershed, so one tends to use the term territory there. What we're trying to show is that watershed management, there's a lot of experience, and the policymakers should not start to have to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of experience there, a lot of knowledge, and we need to draw on that for climate resilience. But in order to make a convincing case for the policymakers, we need to reassess the different technologies that are used in the watershed in terms of climate resilience, and to demonstrate that they really are helping communities to be more resilient, and to obviously adapt, like the genetic varieties, etc., is obviously a really important part. If the rainfall becomes more erratic, it's not just through soil and water conservation. One needs to also think about which short season crops one can introduce into the cropping strategy, which livestock breeds are more resilient, and how you can increase the fodder, etc. So there's many ways. So I think watershed management has developed over the years, and initially it was very much a natural resources approach. And I think there was a lot of learning in the 1980s and 90s that it has to be people-centered and participatory. And I'm sorry if we presented rather a natural resources perspective. I think it's because the pictures show the resources, and it's difficult to show enough pictures about the community participation aspect. I think we all tried to present that as well. And the organizations, the institutions, I think we all talked around that. Yeah, that's maybe some comments there.
Yeah, thank you, Sally. Dieter, one strong argument, why is the watershed management fit also appropriate to address the climate change, the adaptation to climate change issue? You have one convincing argument?
Well, not only one, I guess, but I try to show this. I think this approach, so with these techniques, and there are a lot of more of them, not only sort of hardware, there are also soft techniques that you may use, like regulations, how to use common lands and so on. I think what you get a stabilization, as I said, a stabilization of the production. You get even an increase of the production, and you involve the people, you involve all the stakeholders, which means that they are much better apt afterwards to react to all different kinds of problems. So they have conflict resolution mechanisms that they develop, they improve their negotiation capacity and so on. For me, these are all, let's say, elements of a stronger resilience against climate change. So, but this is sort of the classical approach without talking about adaptation to climate change only. So there was another question, well, did the climate adaptation debate, did this change anything in the concept or in the techniques? And indeed, at least for the Niger example, it did indeed. Like, for example, small utilization of irrigation potentials became a much stronger point. Linking to markets became a much stronger point. And also, well, this is rather technical, like the entire intervention zone was centered around, well, fossil valleys that traditionally had a higher water level, water table. So by centering all the treatments closer to these fossil valleys, we hoped that we could sort of re-establish these fossil water tables further down. So this was a rearrangement of the spatial intervention zone. So there were concrete changes here.
Thank you, Dieter. Maybe again to you the question, critically ask, what kind of donors, if at all, or can you name one or some of them who are ready to engage for such a long-term investment, who do not think and plan, invest in the classical project cycles of 3 to 8 years, say?
Yeah, voluntarily, because this is something I really would like to put a little bit up on the screen. I think German Development Corporation, they had a big advantage in former times that projects could be planned over, let's say, at least 12 years, 12 to 15 years. And they have abandoned this approach, so we are back to the project approach that uses 3 to 5 year projects. And I think it's even more so for the other donors. But I think this is exactly something that we need to change, because we don't respond to long-term problems in these countries with short-term projects of 3 to 5 years. That's completely inappropriate as an approach. It costs a lot of money to start these projects all the time, to close them down again, to restart them again. That's an extremely expensive type of implementing activity. So I think this is something that should be changed at the political level. But there are also other possibilities to change this, and I think Crispino has shown one example. This is by setting up sort of multi-donor baskets. At least then you have the possibility or the potential, if one donor draws out, perhaps another one is coming in, or the rest of the donors stays within this trust and continues to the funding. But basically, I guess such programs, they have to be hooked up into national policies. A country has to decide, well, this helps the country, this stabilizes our national production, food production. So this is something that we should maintain for the next 50 years. If you think about these terraces in Asia, they were not constructed during one generation. It took even hundreds of years.
Yeah, just the way round back again, Sally.
Thank you. I think that we have to be innovative, and I think the public-private partnerships is probably the new way forward. How do we get the private sector to invest in these sorts of strategies that we're talking about? Because if you're putting in a hydroelectric power plant, obviously it makes sense to think about a much longer term, maybe 40 years, 30, 40 years. If one's putting in incentives like payments for environmental services, one would hope that that's not just a short-term project cycle. So I think the green water credits, the payments for environmental services for biodiversity conservation, and also for carbon. Now, unfortunately, the carbon markets are not very favorable at the moment, but that's certainly a way forward if we can find a way of packaging, because most watershed projects actually generate multiple benefits, not just one of these advantages. And so maybe we need to be a little bit innovative in thinking how to package these together and to provide some sort of funding for watershed management for the achievement of these environmental benefits that have global implications. And that might be a new, interesting GEF project. So if anyone wants to think about that further, maybe we should think about designing one and getting some funding from the Global Environmental Facility to do that.
Thank you, Sally. Crispina, you had in your presentation the aspect of sustainability addressed particularly.
Yes.
And I recall that you said that's something you have to think of from the very beginning, actually, and to set up structures. From your side, any other kind of innovation or innovative approaches you possibly can contribute from your experience in order to sustain support for long-term support?
Okay, I'll combine it with the other question also that was raised, is to what extent does watershed development actually address the issue of climate change or build adaptive capacity? Somebody had asked that. And I'll combine it also with the issue of sustainability. You see, from the practitioner's point of view, from the farmer's perspective, climate change manifests itself in two major ways. One is in terms of rainfall received and in terms of rising temperatures. Now, when you adopt a watershed approach, basically you address the issue of water substantially. Because by harvesting it across a catchment, you first ensure that you increase the amount of water available, and you lengthen the period of its availability as well as its quantity. Okay, so in terms of hydrological flows, that's excellent. By planting trees and biomass, you also to an extent create impact microclimates. To that extent, to a very some degree, you at least affect or mitigate the impacts of extreme temperature. But what watershed development per se cannot do is to address the whole issue of variability, both in terms of rainfall as well as temperature, as well as in erratic or extreme weather events. That's why together with watershed development or ecosystems management, you need to also bring in new components. Now that comes to the second part, what are the new things which lead to sustainability? One is definitely you need to include agrometeorology. Farmers need to have access to forecasts of likely weather outcomes as well as action that they should take, both in terms of community action as well as in terms of farming package of practices to adapt to these extreme weather events. Like for instance, should I sow now or should I wait a week later? Or should I sow before the normal traditional day of sowing? Should I use the same crops I've been doing or should I change? Because likely the weather patterns and the rainfall patterns may change in the next 2 or 3 weeks. What type of cattle and livestock should I keep? These are fundamental decisions for farming communities. So you need to bring in livestock agriculture, which is linked to emerging weather patterns or forecast weather patterns, number one. Number two, you need to now focus also on crop water productivity. So drip irrigation, more bang for the buck in a way of more output per drop of water. These are concepts which you never thought of before. We thought of harvesting as much rainwater. Now we need to think not only of harvesting, but how to use it most productively. The third thing is we ignored in the past biodiversity, both natural as well as agricultural. We have to bring that in now. And you see, soil health was never a real major concern in watershed programs before. You need to look at soil health because unless you develop that in terms of increased organic content, you're not going to be able to improve the availability of soil moisture for crops, and therefore even protecting crops against periods of dry spells. So apart from that, you need to move into environmentally friendly agriculture. It's no longer a fad. Methods that actually improve soil health not only increase agriculture productivity, but also reduce the cost of production. So today, because of the market nexus, you need to not only improve productivity, you need to reduce drastically the cost of producing that same amount. That's where the farmer can make surpluses. So yes, today you need to do things not only the same way as was done in the past, but also differently with new components. Now with regard to sustainability, some of the pictures I showed you there were actually closed down. That means the project had ended as much as 12 to 13 years ago. They're still going strong. The point is this. People, if you do a thing right with the people themselves doing it in which they've invested their own contribution, then they tend to own up to what was done and they protect it. But they will not protect it because they did something. They'll protect it because what they've done is directly improving their yields and their incomes. So they need to see the direct link between what was done and what they're benefiting now. If that link is broken, however much they may agree with what has been done, it's unlikely they will invest the effort, the time, and the energy in protecting it. Number one. Number two, it's very important that children who, that's the reality, that intergenerational issues, that unless people have gone through hardships and worked their way out of it, and that experience is transmitted to succeeding generations, it is not likely that what was achieved will necessarily be continued by succeeding generations. They need to be exposed and reminded of where they've come from and the importance of securing and protecting what their parents or ancestors have achieved in order for them to invest in continuing it and developing it further. And lastly, of course, one must also be open to the fact that many of the changes that take place externally, either to political changes or whatever, is not in our control. So we have to always keep reinventing things, drawing upon the past but adding new things, and evolving and changing to accommodate new situations and pressures. There is no such thing as sustainability which is frozen in time. It's a constantly evolving concept, even though it builds on the past, and quite strongly so. Thank you.
Thank you for this very nice summary. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are concluding. And you might have asked yourself, who is this gentleman sitting right to me? This is Geoffrey Campbell. And Geoffrey is working for the FAO, and you are managing a facility, I read.
Forest and farm.
Forest and farm facility, which, again, I searched that from the internet, where you would like particularly to give a voice to make people articulate their needs, their plans, their intentions of forest or farmers' organizations, etc. Now, Geoffrey today is here to help us and to try to summarize, to address again, to name again what he thinks were highlights of these discussions, takeaways for us, and looking a bit forward what is ahead of us. Please, Geoffrey.
Well, I know there's not much time, and I thought that was quite a good summary at the end. I think the question from my perspective is, or the exciting thing which climate change has made us do, is to begin to realize that we have to think like natural resource-dependent communities. And natural resource-based and dependent communities have to think about the entire natural resource base where they live. I love that term you use, spaces of survival. Climate change is about our spaces of survival. And too often, we've treated those in kind of boxes. This is the forestry box, this is the water box, this is the agriculture box, this is the science box, etc. Too often, we've created governments in that same structure, we've funded things in that structure, but now we've come to realize that to solve these problems, we actually have to take a landscape perspective. So the issue for me is not so much how does watershed management experience somehow fit into climate change? It's how does climate change and the way we approach it learn from efforts to actually address functional landscapes. And I think we've heard some very important ones here. One of those is without the community being at the core of those activities, without their tenure being clear, their governance systems being recognized, the diversity of each gender's role in that space, their relationship to governments, private sectors, outside powers. Without taking that at the core, we will not address climate change, just like we can't do integrated watershed management. Without a holistic and integrated approach that we heard about, which really links these different sectors together, we won't address climate change. Without drawing on traditional knowledge and then using science in a practical manner, we heard these great examples of actually getting short-term meteorological forecasts back to farmers. How many science products that all of us have been involved in are regularly on a sort of a periodic basis, let's say every month, getting back to some farmer or some landscape user? Not often enough. So there's some very interesting and exciting examples of how we can make technology, scientific monitoring much more useful. Why? Because it has to be adaptive. So again, we know that to address climate change, we're going to have to be adaptive, and we're going to have to be adaptive at scale. And learning from lessons of communities who have managed landscapes functionally for a very long time, and who are now being encouraged to simplify them, to reduce their agricultural systems to single crops, to change to a single monoculture biofuel system, to use all the water once, etc. The forces that are out there are actually trying to simplify. And climate change requires complexity. And we heard about that. That's what we learned from Watersheds. Complexity, diversification. It's not easy. It's messy. But the more complex it is, the more beautiful it is. We saw a picture of women dancing. So I think we have to appreciate that a functional landscape is something that goes beyond just livelihoods, but it has to fulfill a whole area of improved well-being. But that comes through adding value, through the market, through this food stability, security, and it allows us to adapt to all these changes that we can't predict. And one of the largest ones is climate. I know I've got to end. What I was going to say about financing, though, is that we have to turn around our mindset. If we think that really doing good landscape level work can help communities be the kind of engine for rural revitalization, and we emphasize that rural revitalization will fund those landscapes. So we have to turn it around so that we're generating an economy in the rural areas which is actually significant, and that takes a lot of redirection of current investments, which are all going at a much higher level for much more large-scale approaches that are simple and do not address these problems. So I think it was a very, very useful session for us. I think we have very strong arguments to make for a landscape approach and one that can learn from these. And a friend of mine refers to landscapes, functioning landscapes, as the sort of lifeboats of the future. And this focus on water in this session, to me, really showed that how we need to keep those lifeboats afloat to maintain those areas of resilience, of complexity, of genetic material, of adaptive ideas, of social innovation. So I'll stop with that and leave it to you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Very nice summary and concluding. Did really a great job. Okay, then the only thing what remains me to do is to thank people. Thank those who prepared for this session here. It's not only the 2 hours and the 15 minutes presentation of the panelists, but there are quite some hours behind and before in preparing, in setting these different items. Thanks a lot to you. In the background, those who prepared, who organized it around Pascal and his teams, thanks again. And, of course, all these helping hands here in the room. Peter, Giacomo, and Magdalena and his colleague who helped us during the show. All the best to you. I wish you more interesting sessions for tomorrow. And again, much more to take with you to learn for the future. Thank you very much.
There's material over there.
And again, the reminder, there are brochures and materials up there on this end for takeaway physically. Thank you and have a very good evening.
Thank you. Your success is brilliant.
Thank you.
It's great.
Same to you too. It was excellent.
Very nice. Congratulations. Well done. You've done it.
Good job.